Okay, our guest speaker today is Mr. David Hone. David has been a history teacher for some 40 odd years. He's been head of history at a prestigious Melbourne school. He's been head of school at several schools interstate.
Melbourne Grammar.
Melbourne Grammar. He's been to Melbourne Grammar. He's been a U3A lecturer for some 13 years, David.
Yep.
His passion is history. He's still a member of the Rotary Club of Beaumaris, and his topic today is early Australian convict myths. David Hone, give him a big welcome.
Oh, pleasure to be here. I'm a little worried. I can see quite a few familiar faces, and they may have heard a short version of this, but it won't matter because you will have forgotten. Now, so there's the topic, debunking some of the myths of early convict society, and you've been hearing some convict ballads, and here's another one, just and listen to this closely. Oops. I'm not getting it to move, to play. Jeff, is there a reason for that?
No.
There you go.
One Sunday morning as I went walking by Brisbane waters, I chanced to stray. I heard a prisoner his fate bewailing, as on the sunny river bank he lay. I am a native of Aaron's Island, and banished now from my native shore. They tore me from my aged parents, and from the maiden whom I do adore. I'd been a prisoner at Fort Macquarie, at Norfolk Island and Emu Plains, at Castle Hill and at Tuangabi. At all those settlements I've worked in chains, but of all the places of condemnation and penal stations at New South Wales, to Moreton Bay I have found no equal. Excessive tyranny each day prevails. For 3 long years I was beastly treated, and heavy irons on my legs I wore. My back with flogging is lacerated, and often painted with my crimson gore. And many a man from downright starvation lies mouldering now underneath the clay. And Captain Logan, he had us mangled at the triangles of Moreton Bay. Like the Egyptians and ancient Hebrews, we were oppressed under Logan's yoke, till a native black lying there in ambush did give our tyrant his mortal stroke. My fellow prisoners, be exhilarated that all such monsters such a death may find, and when from bondage we are liberated, all former suffering shall fade from mind.
Okay, and in heavy there, some of the words that people associate with the convict era. Bondage, blood, chains, lacerated, mangled on his triangle, tyrants, bondage, we are liberated, all of those things. And of course the places mentioned there are places of secondary punishment, which about 3% of convicts would have experienced. So, So This is a 30-hour course that this comes from, into 40 minutes, so we might be a bit rough around the edges. The work of historians to reveal the true nature of our convict past has mostly been in vain. The convict era is still seen by most as a terrible time of savage cruelty, drunkenness, the lash, chain and vice. And the convicts seen as slaves in chains and driven by the lash. Most people seem to have read Robert Hughes' The Fatal Shore, and they, you know, this is the image as we saw on that clip. You know, chains, convict uniforms, balls of chains, and you know, executions. They haven't read Hagel Shaw. He wrote The Convicts and Colonies in 1966. John Hurst, The Convict Society and Its Enemies. If you haven't read it, it's a brilliant book. And James Boyce, Van Diemen's Land, very recently, great book. Grace Carscombe's The Colony, all about New South Wales, another great book. John Ritchie's biographies of Darcy, Wentworth and Macquarie, as well as his Punishment and Profit, are all wonderful books. The dictionary and biography online is just so many of the early people were convicts, and they're in the dictionary of biography. They pop up all over the place. You know, that's to mention only a few. A woman called Glendinning has written a wonderful book too about the very early days in Port Jackson. And all of these give a very different picture of our convict era. But they're not, it's not as savage and brutal as the popular myth. So The Fatal Shore unfortunately reinforced the myths surrounding the early years of European settlement. You know, it devotes the greater part of the book to the negative side of convict society and highlighting the convict settlements as secondary punishment, as we mentioned already. So, you know, Norfolk Island and its second occupation. It was occupied twice, first by Flinders and then later on. Macquarie Harbour, Moreton Bay, Port Arthur, and these were horrible places, but they were a teeny part of the whole system, experienced you know, by a very few convicts who had offended again in New South Wales, usually quite seriously, because if it was not serious, they would have been flogged. So they were then sent off for a second thing, and they had to go to court and be found guilty. They were just sent there at someone's whim. And by the way, we'll come back to that, but that court was often made up of the jury who were ex-convicts. So, now, another thing about the convict era is that you've got to understand, you know, it was all controlled from the British Parliament and their views on things. And they had a very favourable view of transportation before 1775, because as you can see in the diagram, they paid to have the exiles, the people they no longer, because they only had three forms of punishment. You basically killed people, flogged them, or exiled them, you know, or put him in the stocks. There was no jail. You didn't. Penitentiaries are a 19th century Benthamite invention. You've all heard of the punishment should fit the crime in Gilbert and Sullivan. That's a Benthamite idea, that the punishment should, that they should be graduated according to the crime. Anyway, the Great Britain paid to transport to the American colonies, where they were dealt with by the American colonies at no expense to the British taxpayer. So, and that was why they loved it. Of course, then the Americans revolt in 1775, declared their independence in 1776, and they have to come up with a new scheme. Now, you can see there the Benthamite reformers wanted penitentiaries, but they wanted to have a much more controlled method of punishing people through penitentiary, which is the one we have today. Okay, so but the Great Britain, they liked the idea, the old idea of sending them to America. So as there was no America, they came up with Van Diemen's Land. We won't go into all the reasons they settled there. It was more than convicts, but So they had to pay for the transportation, send them to New South Wales, then they finished their sentences. And another thing they liked about the American model was that most remain in the colony and no longer in Great Britain, a problem if not reformed. Because if you send someone off somewhere, if you punish them at home, as we know, send them to jail, they come out again, they re-offend. So this scheme here, the bottom one was the one that was rejected by Parliament, and that meant from then on the Benthamite reformers disliked the New South Wales convict settlement, and they were always looking for reasons to criticise it. And that's one of the reasons why John Hurst calls his book The Convict Society and Its Enemies. So there was a lot of do-gooders in England who were just out to can it. And so there. So, and one of the things they didn't like is that the Benthamite reformers, once they finished their sentences, were they reformed? Whereas if they stayed in New South Wales, who cared?
Good question, same today, Dave.
Now the joke is, as we'll see, the joke is that those convicts that we'll see in Australia, in the main they were reformed. And that stupidly the British Parliament and a lot of the reformers started to object to that because they weren't to be punished. They lost the logic. And of course one of the things about this scheme that they adopted, but the cost of running the penal settlement was down to the British Parliament. And that was in the old days, they didn't have to pay anything. So there was always this negative feeling, the governors in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, they're causing us expense. Okay, so most convicts were minor offenders. Okay, everyone, they only stole a handkerchief, that sort of stuff. Who were the convicts? And you can see here, here's a drawing of convicts in New Holland in 1793, and notice they're wearing civvies. You wouldn't know they were convicts. So probably 2/3 had formerly been punished by public justice, generally for forms of larceny. And remember, formally, so these are second and third offenders. The prisoners transported for life formed approximately a quarter of these convicts. They the ones were found, were to be executed. It was far more common for a felon to receive a 7-year sentence, and every second convict was transported for that minimum period. Okay? Think Fagin, not Oliver Twist. A lot of these people were serious offenders. And this is also shows you that here that they're not Fagin's age. They were basically, you can see down here, young men and women. And you can see down here the origins of the convicts. And basically notice the high level of Irish descent, which is one of that ballad is an Irish ballad. So the myth of how many convicts died on their way to, I don't know what's going on here. Put it down here perhaps. The myth of how many convicts died on their way to Botany Bay in 1787 and thereafter. The first fleet which sailed in 1787, the death rate remarkably low given the scale of the operation. This was a bit like, it was a huge endeavour, and 736 convicts, 14,000 miles on their terms. Voyage lasted 252 days. 23 convicts died on the voyage, and a great result by the late 18th century standards. So the first fleet, pretty good news. The death rate on the second fleet in 1790 was much higher than that of its predecessors, 266 out of 1,244. But that caused, we'll see, the survivors were landed in a very weakened condition, and a further 16% died shortly after this embarkation. And Arthur Phillip, really went off and sent, various letters to England saying how appalling this was. Now you remember that would take almost a year and a half to all come to fruition. So the myth, you know, I'm still on this. The second plea prompted great government regulation. A naval trained surgeon was appointed to superintend every transport vessel, which was made. If you were a free settler, there was no surgeon on your ship. Bonus payments for number of convicts landed in good health. And after 1815, surgeons were given authority over all disciplinary and medical matters, including the ventilation and cleaning of the vessel. So the captain had to obey what the surgeon said. These men need air, you know, or something. And this is Angle Shaw's statistics, which he did all those years ago, and you can see quite clearly there, you know, the death rate here. But look, this is see male and female, very low. And going on, you know, from 1800, you get some bad ones, heavy death toll with rebel ships, you know, so they had a bit of trouble on the way out. But generally speaking, very low. Following the introduction of that surgeon, the monthly death rates fell to 2.4 per thousand in the period 1815 to 1868. That's the last period. The equivalent rate for males aged between 15 and 40 on immigrant ships sailing from Europe to the United States, a much shorter journey, between 1836 and 1853 was 4.4 per thousand. Okay? So convicts were less likely to die on the way out than free settlers. Because they were, you know, the free settlers had to look after themselves, they had to have their own food. Convicts just had to live, and they were given a ration just like the seamen. It's all pretty basic stuff, very, very enclosed, but so were everyone on a ship in those days. And the other myth, the long, harsh struggle to establish a colony in a hostile environment, which no one liked. Now this is a view here, there it is, and that's painted by a convict in 1793. Now, it's not a painting of someone, it's a lovely picture, isn't it? I had a lot more of those when I was doing this course. A lot of the convicts painted pictures, and there now we have them all. Well, not all, we have enough to get an idea of what they were thinking. And Philip arrives in January 1788, and 5 years later, then we did, you know, setting up a colony all those years away. It was a big, all those miles away was a big ask. But by 1800, a trade port 12 years after foundation. And I've got these statistics to show you. These are I made up to demonstrate the difference between American colonies and Australian colonies. We had public funding from the British government. The American colonies were all free enterprise colonies, so they had no government money, no capital coming in. They had to provide their own capital. And as a result, as you can see, if you take the total one here in 50 years, they've grown, you know, from a small here to 75,000. But in 50 years, Australia has grown to over 200,000. This is a much, now, this is 19th century. True, this is earlier, but the difference is huge, as this graph shows. There you can see, there is New South Wales, there is New England, and there is Virginia. Not much different to the north and south in America. And this is to do with, and I think the next slide, yeah, this is to do with this. These are the Treasury bills spent on New South Wales for its foundation, and this was this is what they didn't like. You can see the first one, £891. That's a lot of money, but it goes up rapidly, doesn't it? Look, 13,000 here, and then we have a good year here, and then look, 37 here, and then they're in war. They're at war now against the French, and they're still copping up. So there's quite a bit of economy here. When you come down, you notice here Macquarie arrives in 1810, and he spent up big. And that's why he never got knighted. And he liked him, he spent too much money. We loved him, Australians loved Macquarie, because he actually tidied up Sydney, but it was the British taxpayers who were paying for it. And they send out Commissioner Big to investigate, and he finds, he comes up with a solution which he calls punishment and profit. So, the hostile environment, the diaries, letters, watercolours and flora and fauna of the officers reveal a fascination and appreciation of the new environment. The officers tend to return. Once they've finished their tour of duty, they often get out of the Army or the Navy and return to New South Wales because they love it and they know that this is a place they can make a heap of money. And they like the climate, they like the whole box and dice. Van Diemen's seen as a fertile paradise. They just love the place. Watercolours, you know, there's those water, and there's many more of these, but you know, you can see them there. And these are by George Raper and Captain John Hunter, who becomes the governor. He was on the Cirrus. And by the way, the reason they could do this was that all naval lieutenants in the British Navy at this time had to learn to be good watercolourists so that they could paint shorelines, so that other captains would then recognise that coast. So that's why they all, you know, they were pretty good at producing, but they didn't have cameras, of course. So this is the thing that John Hurst really carries on about. The myth of the Philip set up a penal settlement, and he would say it was a colony of convicts from 1788 to 1820, failed attempt at after Big here, and then we get a colony of 3 people. Why no penal settlement? Because the British government never intended to set one up. No such concept existed in government thinking about punishment, flogged, hanged or sent to America. So this was a new idea. We're sending them to New South Wales. With the New South Wales more involved, so you had to have a governor, marines, establishment expenses. But from day one, New South Wales came to look like a republic of convicts. Marines go on strike, refusing to supervise convicts, even in the construction of their own barracks, because that's not what we do. We're here to defend. We're not here. We're not superintendents of convicts. So they refused to do it. And Governor Phillip appoints convicts as overseers whose pay was not to work. So you've got convicts overseeing convicts. And very quickly they started using the assignment system. So, you know, you were sent to New South Wales and you either ended up working for the government or working for an individual who could be an ex-convict. I don't know what's going on here. Over there on the field.
Should be back up with your hand microphone.
It'll be better there. Yeah. Okay, so they, yeah, and basically free settlers, officers, and imagine, you know, the officers often got themselves a plot of land and some convicts to. Can you hear on the back there?
That's better. You turn it down a bit here.
Yeah, righto. So there they are. And of course, the women convicts were often given to officers and also as domestic servants, washerwomen. Governor Phillips famously went to Norfolk Island with Philip sent him there, and in the books you see washerwoman, and in fact he has 2 children by that washerwoman. And the marvellous story is that he then sent back to England by Philip. The family get him married to a good gal, then comes back to New South Wales with her, but his concubine in New South Wales has since shacked up with another officer. And the marvellous thing about this story is that King sends those 2 children, 2 sons, to Eton. And you know, he lives amicably with his wife, and he has, you know, it's all, you know, this is the 18th, early 19th century sexual morals which were tightened up, you know, in the Victorian era. Anyway, the government convicts were often engaged on public works projects or in administration, and early days convicts were frequently assigned to their free wives, including my wife's relation wills. Because what would happen, you were convicted, and a wife could say, well, I want to go out to Australia with my husband, and they would get on the convict ship as a free person and come out with the convicts, and then the convict would be assigned to them. My wife's time, we found that very amusing. In 1821, the assignment became the majority destination, and it was criticised by reformers for being a lottery, because obviously if you're assigned to an individual, it would all depend on what that person was like. So, you know, they said being transported to New South Wales was a lottery. You could get it good, or you could get a horrible master like Marsden, the minister. Now, the convict working day meant to work from dawn till dusk. Convicts overseers quickly adopted the system of daily task work, which when finished left the convicts free to leave. This is because, you know, we're not talking with malleable material here, we're talking with very reluctant workers, and you're trying to get them to do something. You can't just flog them all the time, you've got to, I'll come back to that in a minute. If convicts applied themselves, they could be finished by midday. The convicts thus developed the concept of their own time, which they defended vigorously. Convicts provided for their own lodgings and cooked their own meals. These guys are not in jail, are they? Yeah, and it took years for the governors to claim back some of the afternoon. Final rule was the convicts were not to work their private master or the government until 3:30 in the afternoon. You know, they had to work for the government until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then after that it was their time. Government Quarry in 1840 enforced a full day's work for private masters, but the masters had to pay for the work they did after 3 o'clock. And this became known as their wage. Okay, so, you know, a master could send an offending servant to court where they could be awarded a flogging, but this was no guarantee of good service. Power to hurt is not the same as the power to command constant obedience. Convicts did not only work because of the fear of the lash, but masters quickly learnt that they needed to use other methods, which were, you know, incentives. You know, you do this, you can have the afternoon off. Less than 50% came from the country. You know, they basically were urban dropouts. And if you're a country convict, far more likely to adapt to being assigned to a settler. You know, you'd be good news. You know, you'd be able to help. Most of the convicts came from the disorderly sort, chiefly from the towns, who were unused to regular hours, regular employment, hard manual labour. You know, these are the product of the agricultural and industrial revolution. Large numbers were professional thieves, so masters of New South Wales had to struggle hard to get these people to work at all, and it was they who forced the masters to settle for something less than having good servants. So, you know, and if you think about it, if you've got 10 convicts working for you on an isolated farm in New South Wales, you know, beating them is not the solution, is it?
No.
You've got to come to some accommodation. Now, some masters adopted, you know, enjoyed punishing them, and they didn't get much out of them. Police constables, set up by Governor Phillip in 1718 to guard the stores, because, you know, there are a lot of thieves around, staffed by convicts. Authority over freemen and marines when they're on duty, and Major Ross, who was the commander of the Marines, had a fit. You know, how can we have convicts telling us what to do? And of course that's why he gets sent home and the New South Wales Corps are sent out. And then convicts become lawyers, architects, surveyors, doctors, teachers, artists, two had been forgers, and government clerks. All of these jobs are filled by convicts and then by ex-convicts. It was hard to get free people to come to the colony to us in the early years. So, and the other thing, we've talked about this, they didn't wear distinctive clothing. Convicts under 18 had to provide their own shelter and cook their own meals, as we've said, and they were provided with meat and flour each week. They rejected maize. Basically, their right was to have, salted beef or pork and flour. They didn't like getting kangaroo. That was not on the, that wasn't the deal. We get that ourselves. You give us the salted meat. And fish, by the way, the other thing the convicts in Sydney could get, very early on was lots of fish. They had far better diet in Australia than Great Britain, and the women become more fecund as a result. They lived in appalling conditions in the cities in Europe, and they noted that suddenly they started popping out children, and of course then there came the whole problem of what are we going to do about that, so convicts had to become teachers to the children. Had to found schools. The emancipator granted 30 acres of land, and emancipator is an ex-convict, granted 30 acres of land, more married and had children that could be assigned convicts. So once you'd finished your term, you were given 30 acres, and if you were married, you get 50. And in their terms, this made them a rich person. The thought of only 50 acres in England, you're part of that, getting near the upper class. And they started to ride horses too, which was something that, back home in England, my God, an ex-convict on a horse. If you came out in the first fleet, another amusing thing about that, the Aborigines saw the difference between the officers and the convicts, and they saw themselves not as the convicts, but as the officers on the horses. It was whereas the Europeans saw the Aborigines as black, sort of people who could be turned into slave labour. That's how they viewed them. So there was a terrible misconception between the two groups about status. All right. And look, if you came out in the first fleet, your chances were that you were going to end up pretty well off, and some of them ended up in our terms billionaires. And they're all in the dictionary of biography. Simeon Lloyd became, a multi-billionaire. And this is the ticket of leave, and just convicts rarely served a full sentence. So if they were well behaved, they were given firstly a ticket of leave on a 7-year sentence after 4 or 5 years. Okay, and of course this meant, of course, they were off the government books. They had to support themselves. That was the economic part of this. And on a 14-year sentence, 6 to 8 years. Now, very rarely did a convict serve 14 years. If they did, they had behaved very badly and were probably sent to a place of secondary punishment. But they had to remain in a specified area. The certificate freedom was given once they'd finished their sentence, and then they could go back to England if they wanted to, or if they could afford to. The additional pardon, that was for the lifers who behaved well, and they could then have freedom, just like a ticket of leave, but they couldn't leave New South Wales. And an absolute pardon was for lifers who, or any convict who had done something exceptionally good, saved a life, that sort of stuff. Yeah. Okay, and there's convict clothing. This is, just to make the point, this is the 17 to 1820s, and this is not on assignment. That is, if you were in a chain gang later on in the 1830s. But everyone sort of assumes that the convicts were like that. Female convicts are another area of great misconception. Now, always a minority, the British government wanted to have women as settlement, and they were very worried about homosexuality. Can't have all these men together, shocking. And they even thought of bringing Pacific Island women in to solve this issue. And no sleeping quarters provided to the women convicts, free from official work after 3 p.m, and had to take extra work to support themselves. And Samuel Marsden, who reported a lot of negative things about, he was a real wowser and also a most unpleasant man who flogged convicts as much as he could, and he took a very dim view of the women's behaviour and said they survived on prostitution. But in fact, many shared a man's bed on a semi-permanent basis in return for shelter, and casting rights of women home builders. It's a bit like that story about Governor Phillip and the washerwoman. Darcy Wentworth, he had 2 wives, one in Sydney and one in Parramatta. And the family were quite happy with this. William Wentworth got on well with his half-brothers. Many of us had children by convict mistresses in long-term relationships. And this is just a diagram to show you the ratio of men to women. So there are many more men, but as Hurst pointed out, in a penal colony, you certainly wouldn't have women. You wouldn't have people making little family homes and having children together. This is not what a penal settlement's about at all. English evangelicals, Marsden and others, they were shocked by the easygoing sexual arrangements they observed. They wrote back in horror to the United Kingdom. But many former prostitutes from London became successful founders of families. And in 1810, Macquarie started to encourage the transformation of these relationships into formal marriages by offering them bigger grants of land and all that sort of stuff. It wasn't 100% successful, but it went in the right direction. Now, the other myth is that the emancipate convicts were a hopeless, drunken lot who died out without issue. So ex-convicts, what happened to them? Now, the convict stain, Australians have been all through the 19th century and into the 20th century, we were very worried about the convict stain. And that's, by the way, why Gallipoli was such a relief. They didn't run away. They were the children who had a lot of convict blood in them, and they were all into blood. Blood was terribly important. And if you were British, that made you stronger and better. If you had convict blood, you knew they were dodgy. But so Gallipoli, they were very relieved. The Australians ran into battle and blah, blah, blah. But one way of dealing with it is to say, but the convicts all died out. They didn't have any children, and they just disappeared under this deluge of free settlers. So there's been a lot of debate about their economic fate, but the majority were better off in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. Some, as I said, became billionaires. And reform, the great majority, actually became useful citizens. They might have been a bit dodgy, still trying to take something if they could get away with it, rough and ready, but in any punishment system, what the British government should have been doing is rejoicing in how successful all of this was. And so should Australian history. It isn't actually an example of a punishment system that sort of worked, not 100%, but certainly more than 50, and which we can't say today. You cannot say that today. Residents, Australia, 10% went home up to 1820, and after this much less. Now that's partly to do with the fact that they couldn't afford it, but it also actually means that quite a few of them didn't want to go home. And in fact, we know they wrote home and said, come out and join me. And here, this is just showing you the population of this one now, 1850. You can see here are the free settlers, the free immigrants, but look, even in 1851, the great pie is made up of convicts and ex-convicts. And then you've got all their children who, in 19th century terms, the child of an ex-convict, whoops, are they okay? This is some of the historians have found these. Men transplanted prior to 1820, 50% did well according to the 1828 census. Landowners, merchants, tradesmen. One man had secured land. It was rare, and once a man had secured land, it was rare indeed if it had been granted at or after 1806 that he was not still a landholder in 1821 or 1828. Now it's hard to know exactly what happened, but when you look into it, there's a lot of sign of success. Rowe, he did 1,000 arrivals in these 6 years, and had a look at the censuses, and fewer than 200 had become merely labourers or servants bereft of property. So basically, you know, their 800 had done quite well, and 100 had become landless tradesmen, but that could lead to big things. Great majority owned something, even over, if only 15 acres and 2 cattle. The norm was 50 acres and 10 to 20 cattle, which mean, in English terms, they're now quite solid citizens. And this is just showing you the state holdings in August 1804, and the less than 200. These are the convicts, and you can see there's quite a few of them there. Now, of course, these are the officers, or Simeon Lord, someone like that. But, and then you can see here the kind of small-scale settlers down to 1808, and you can see, look, a lot's happening. You can see they're into hogs in a big way, but they're getting into sheep as well. But the officer class was starting to pasture stock rather than have agriculture. And of course, the main here, there was some, and this was corn in the main. Well, this is another little map. This is of the Toorak of Botany Bay or Port Jackson. By the way, the British continued to call Sydney, New South Wales, Port Jackson, Botany Bay, right down into the 1850s, which really annoyed people. You know, the officials would call them, we're sending these people to Botany Bay. They hadn't got the point. They had moved from Botany Bay to Port Jackson. This is here is early Sydney, and you can see these little blue arrows are showing where convicts are living. And this is the creme de la creme of Sydney society. And we've got a few others. Mary Haycock, convict, 13-year-old in Sydney. She married in 1794, very young. But that's Thomas Reevy, private trader. And that's Mary Reevy, who goes on to have a great career. And you get here, Thomas Randall, convicts. He's down here. And we keep going. Di's ancestor, hire robber, father of Wills of Victoria. he moves in there. And here we have this convict arrived in Sydney, merchant, innkeeper, farmer, N. Rosanna Abraham's, the daughter of Esther Johnson, 3 sons. So this woman marries Esther. These men marry Esther Johnson, one of them, and he, of course, was a high-flying official. And the convicts on the courts, convicts could not receive any further punishment except by court order. So you couldn't just flog a convict. You had to take them to court. Before the court, they appeared in the usual way as innocents until proven guilty. They could not be referred to as convicts or ex-convicts in court. The masters had to take convicts to magistrate court for offences against the labour code, being lazy, running away, getting drunk, abuse, all of that stuff, insolence. But would you bother? That's the question. Now you would if you were annoyed. So unlikely to get off, but masters could not punish them themselves. Since most people knew were convicts, they had to be allowed to give evidence in court. So they therefore could give evidence against their masters. Convicts had to be considered as owners of property, so they could be charged with pinching it. The first case in criminal court concerned a convict who had stolen another's bread ration. You can see how this is sort of turning the whole thing on its head, isn't it? The convicts are actually citizens, aren't they? And that's why John Hurst said it's a convict colony, not a penal settlement. Convicts could protect their property by bringing action in court, but they could take people to court. And in fact, it was a very litigious society, early New South Wales, unbelievable. And with duels as well, so it's the whole thing. The officers were right into it. The children of convicts were free. This is the next one, the convicts were not slaves. You often hear people saying it's slavery. Well, they're not. The children are not free, but in slave societies they are slaves. Convicts had fixed term of conviction, which could only be increased in a court of law. Convicts could marry. Convicts were granted tickets of leave, as we've seen, could only be punished after a court trial. Most lived in their own accommodation of war ordinary clothing. They were not in chains. Now the chain gang is for those places of secondary convicts, and later on, after Big and in the 30s, there was a move back to having convicts in chain gang working on the roads. It was an absolute disaster, and they had to pull back from it. Now lastly, flogging. 83 was a typical year, 7,100 floggings in a convict population of 27,000, about 25%. Okay? Only occurred after taking the offender to court, as we've seen. Flogger a convict. So there's that is an interesting fact to bear in mind. The master could be an ex-convict. The magistrate could be an ex-convict. 12 to 50 lashes the norm. And by the way, that 12 to 50 lashes, that was the norm in the Navy and the Army as well. There wasn't anything exceptional about this. In the Navy, if you'd really done something really bad, you could be flogged round the fleet. Basically that would kill you.
Dragged underneath.
Convicts preferred flogging to extension of sentence. So if you gave them a choice, do it 2 more years or have a flogging, I'll take a flogging. Similar with in the Navy, quite often seamen would prefer a flogging to some other form of, say, weeks off the grog ration. Governments progressively restricted the number of lashes to be given by magistrates, and after about 1870, flogging females was prohibited, but had never been prevalent. Must be viewed in its social context. You can't, we're in the 19th century here, not the 21st. Whipping and flogging in English society. Here's some pictures for you. It was the norm. Children were flogged. Soldiers were flogged. Flogging was one of the ways you instead of putting them in jail, you flogged them. These are just pictures from the night. And here is a school scene. See that? The child over another child. In the Army and Navy, they quite often put the soldier over or the sailor over a cannon and flogged them like that. But here you see it happening in a schoolroom. And this is late Victorian times. Children severely flogged. And notice this is the police here doing the flogging. And flogging was the norm in schools. Schools, and we all were brought up in that school system, where we were beaten. Okay, but here's another one. Main school, this is just to show that it's not just, it's very prevalent in 19th century. And that's it.
Very good.
We've got time for. We haven't got a great deal of time. A couple of questions. David will be joining us for lunch. We'll be having a drink, so if you want to catch him there. So if anyone got a couple of questions before we finish up the break, one down
Have
here.
you ever been to Eastern Tasmania? Oh,
Yes.
sorry, Western Tasmania.
Yes.
Yeah, we had a family connection across there. They weren't convicts, and went to this church.
Yep.
And they were up in the gallery, and they had a curtain across, and they were put up there, and it was very interesting.
So that to hide the convicts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got a question. The death rate on the second fleet, I understood that was as a consequence of the contract.
Yes, it was. And that's why they changed that. The contractor had no motive to deliver them in good shape to...
The contract made money out of the rations they saved.
Yes, exactly. And also, Darcy Wentworth was on that ship, on that fleet, and he was the surgeon. He's been himself shacked up. and produced William Wentworth on the way out to Australia with a convict girl who obviously had her head screwed on and moved in with Darcy Wentworth, who, by the way, had been found not guilty 4 times for highway robber, and his relation, Lord Fitzwilliam, said to him on the 5th time, look, I think it's time that you have a rest from us. We'll send you, you can go to New South Wales as a surgeon, which is what he did, and he had a very successful life, made a lot of money, and of course we get William Charles Wentworth from that, who was the, basically wrote the New South Wales Constitution.
Oh, one more, yes?
David, how did the British government convince free settlers to go to Botany Bay?
Yep, that after Commissioner Big, they're all, the clever ones were already onto it, the officers and people like that, you know, MacArthur, but you, punishment and profit. The idea was you'd get free labour and land grants. You know, and we're talking not 50 acres now, we're talking 10,000 acres. So if you came out right in the 20s and you were a reasonably wealthy settler, you had the great advantage of getting a nice slab of land granted to you, free, no, so it's yours. So in Tasmania, why a lot of the landed families are still there, is they got land grants. They didn't, you know, it was given to them freehold. None like the squatters, who in the end, they were squatting on it, and then they were leasing it, and then they had to pay for it. Yeah.
We'll have to call it quits because Tom is going to catch up with us. Mr Harding, our Vice President, is going to vote. Give the vote of thanks.
Yep.
Yes, sir. Pass on that. No, just in there. Just talk. Just talk. No, not in that.
Not into that.
That's a microphone.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm very pleased to move this vote of thanks to our guest speaker, David Hone, today, because I'm one of those familiar faces that David mentioned. For the last few years, David has been my lecturer in Australian history at Bayside U3A, which I highly recommend. And more recently, he's been my lecturer in Roman history. Now, I've studied Roman history at Monash, and David's course is much better. Now, and why do I say that? Because you saw a demonstration of that today. David's talks are chock full of facts and figures, but also different perspectives. So when talking about convicts, we just didn't hear about Robert Hughes. We heard about from other sources as well, and always in a very entertaining way and in good humour. So I highly recommend David's courses at Bayside U3A. If you want to join, you can attend by Zoom still. And also David has also in the past given courses about American history.
Yes.
And Chinese history.
Chinese history, Russian history.
Russian history. So I'd urge you to join Bayside U3A and look up the index and go to one of David's courses. So thanks very much, David.
Well, thanks for the promo.
So that was a fantastic.